Okay, stop for a second. Because the Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky divorce mystery just got another layer of intrigue. For years, fans have been asking the same question. If Kyle and Mauricio have been separated since 2023, why aren't they divorced yet? They don't live together. They've both explored separate lives. They've publicly discussed the possibility of divorce. And yet, there are still no divorce papers. No final legal ending. Just this strange space between marriage and separation that Kyle herself has described as a grey area. And now, the name Lisa Rinna is being pulled into the conversation. But here's where we have to separate the viral headline from the verified story. There is no confirmed public statement from Rinna establishing some secret reason behind Kyle and Mauricio's divorce delay. So instead of pretending she revealed something she hasn't, let's look at the information that actually makes this situation so fascinating. Because Kyle has already admitted something that could change how fans see the entire story. She and Mauricio haven't filed any paperwork. Not even a legal separation. And according to Kyle, they are trying to handle everything on their own terms and avoid turning their family into a battlefield. But then she said something even more interesting. They still have love and respect for each other. After 27 years together. Kyle says you don't simply erase that kind of relationship overnight. And that may explain why this divorce has moved so slowly. But wait. There's another twist. Kyle has also admitted that she and Mauricio have recently had conversations about what their future is actually going to look like. So something is changing. The question is, what? Is this simply a peaceful separation? Are they protecting their family? Are they dealing with complicated financial and personal ties? Or is there still an emotional connection that makes officially ending the marriage harder than anyone expected? Kyle has denied that she's simply waiting around for Mauricio to come back. So this isn't necessarily a secret reconciliation story. It may be something much more complicated. Two people who spent decades building a family, trying to figure out how to separate without destroying everything they built together. And that is where the Lisa Rinna angle becomes interesting. Because Lisa knows the world of Beverly Hills better than almost anyone. She knows how quickly private relationship problems can become public storylines. She knows how reality television can turn a complicated marriage into a simple headline. And she knows that what viewers see on camera isn't always the complete story. So tonight, we are going to separate the rumor from the receipts. What Kyle has actually revealed. What Mauricio has said. Why they still haven't filed. And the one detail that could finally force them to make a decision. Because after nearly 3 years apart, Kyle and Mauricio can't stay in the grey area forever. And Kyle has already admitted that herself. The real question isn't whether the divorce is coming. It's what finally makes them choose a direction. Let's go back to the beginning. Because the strangest part of Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky's story isn't necessarily that they separated. It's what happened after. For 27 years, Kyle and Mauricio built a life together. A family. A home. A business world. A public identity. And for years, viewers watched them as one of Beverly Hills' most recognizable couples. Then, in 2023, everything changed. They separated. But instead of immediately moving toward a traditional divorce, Kyle and Mauricio entered something much harder to define. They continued living separate lives, while remaining legally married. And that grey area has lasted for years. Kyle has now confirmed that they are not legally separated and that they haven't filed the necessary paperwork. She has explained that every couple handles these situations differently and that she and Mauricio have been trying to navigate theirs amicably, particularly with their family in mind. And that's where the mystery begins. Because if the marriage had truly reached its final chapter, why not simply make it official? Why keep waiting? Why continue having conversations about the future? And why does Kyle still describe Mauricio with words like love and respect? Those questions have become even more interesting because Kyle has made another thing very clear. She's not simply sitting around waiting for Mauricio to return. When asked whether she was waiting for him to come back, her answer was no. So this doesn't appear to be a simple story about one person desperately hoping for reconciliation. It's much more complicated. Two people can decide that their marriage isn't working and still care deeply about each other. They can live separately and still remain connected through their family. They can move forward individually without turning decades of history into a public war. And Kyle has essentially described that kind of situation. She has said that after building such a long life together, the love and respect don't simply disappear. She also explained that there has been no third party forcing them to file or pushing them toward a legal battle. Instead, they've been handling it on their own terms and in their own time. That sentence may explain more than all the rumors combined. Their timeline belongs to them. Not the fans. Not the media. Not their reality show audience. And not even the people around them. But there's still a problem. Kyle has admitted that they won't stay in this grey area forever. And she revealed that there have been more conversations recently about what their future is actually going to look like. That means something is moving. Maybe slowly. But it's moving. And now the question becomes, what happens when those conversations finally lead to a decision? Could the marriage finally be dissolved? Could they somehow redefine their relationship again? Or could something happen that neither Kyle nor Mauricio expected? Because while the internet loves the idea of a secret reconciliation, Kyle has already pushed back against that narrative. And Mauricio has also publicly described himself as single and happy on his own. So perhaps the truth isn't nearly as dramatic as the rumors. Perhaps the real story is about two people who spent almost 3 decades together and are trying to figure out how to separate without destroying the family and history they created. But then, why has this taken so long? That's the question we are going to dig into. Because the longer Kyle and Mauricio remain legally married, the more complicated the story becomes. And there may be several reasons why neither one has been willing to rush toward the final signature. And this is where the story gets more complicated. Because if Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky were completely finished with each other emotionally, you would expect the separation to look very different. But Kyle has repeatedly made one thing clear. There is still love and respect between them. And after 27 years of marriage, that matters. It doesn't automatically mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean Kyle is secretly waiting for Mauricio. And it doesn't mean the divorce isn't coming. It simply means that ending a marriage and ending every emotional connection are two completely different things. Think about what Kyle and Mauricio actually built together. They didn't just date for a few years. They created a family. They raised 4 daughters. They built businesses. They shared homes. They experienced major successes together. They went through difficult periods together. And for years, their relationship was part of Kyle's public identity. So when the marriage changed, the rest of that life didn't simply disappear. That's one reason their situation has been so difficult for outsiders to understand. People want a clean answer. Are they together? Are they divorced? Are they getting back together? But Kyle and Mauricio appear to exist somewhere in between. They are separated. But they are still family. They are living different lives. But they still have reasons to communicate. And they can still come together for important moments. That became especially obvious as their daughters entered new stages of adulthood. Family milestones don't stop because parents separate. Birthdays still happen. Celebrations still happen. Major life changes still happen. And now, their family is entering another major chapter. Kyle is preparing to become a grandmother as daughter Farah starts her own family. That means Mauricio isn't simply someone from Kyle's past. He's still part of the same family story. And that connection isn't going away. This is why the idea of simply cutting ties doesn't really fit their situation. There are too many years. Too many memories. Too many shared responsibilities. And too much family history. But here's where people sometimes misunderstand Kyle's position. Having love and respect for Mauricio doesn't necessarily mean she wants her marriage back. Those are two different things. Kyle has made it clear that she isn't sitting around waiting for Mauricio to return. She's been exploring her own life. She's been figuring out who she is outside of the marriage. And she's been trying to understand what she actually wants from the future. Mauricio has been doing the same. He's publicly described himself as single and has continued building his own life. So this isn't necessarily two people standing at the door waiting for the other to come back. It may be two people accepting that their marriage changed, while still refusing to turn their history into hatred. And perhaps that's one of the healthiest things about their situation. They don't appear to need a villain. They don't need to publicly destroy one another. They don't need to convince the world that one person was completely right and the other was completely wrong. They can acknowledge that something didn't work, while still appreciating what they had. But that creates another problem. Because eventually, love and respect aren't enough to keep a legal marriage in limbo forever. At some point, a decision has to be made. Kyle has acknowledged that herself. She has said that they won't stay in this gray area forever. And she has revealed that she and Mauricio have been having more conversations about what their future will actually look like. That is significant. Because for years, the public has been waiting for a definitive answer. Now, it sounds like Kyle and Mauricio are finally discussing one themselves. But there's another major factor. Their family doesn't exist in isolation. Their finances, businesses, properties, and years of shared life create practical complications that fans don't always see. A divorce isn't simply two people signing a piece of paper. For a couple who built an entire life together, there can be dozens of decisions behind that signature. And when you're already able to live separately without constantly fighting, there may be less pressure to rush. Why create a legal battle when the current arrangement is working? Why turn a peaceful separation into an ugly public process? That may be one of the reasons Kyle and Mauricio have taken their time. But eventually, even a peaceful arrangement reaches a crossroads. Because the question isn't only, do we still love each other? It's, what do we want our relationship to be from this point forward? And that question could determine everything. Maybe the answer is divorce. Maybe it's continued separation. Maybe it's a new kind of friendship and co-parenting relationship. And while fans may want a dramatic reunion, Kyle's comments suggest something much more realistic. They are trying to figure out what works for them. Not what makes the best headline. Not what satisfies the audience. What actually works for them. And that's why the next stage could be the most revealing. Because once two people start seriously discussing their future, the gray area eventually has to end. And when it does, everyone will finally know whether Kyle and Mauricio were simply delaying a divorce, or whether they were trying to create something completely different from the marriage they once had. And this is where the story gets much more interesting. Because Kyle Richards has actually offered her own explanation for what went wrong. And it wasn't simply one argument. It wasn't simply the reality show. And according to Kyle, it wasn't one single dramatic event. Instead, she has pointed toward a combination of money, fame, traveling, business pressure, and life in Los Angeles as factors that gradually put pressure on the marriage. Think about that for a moment. Kyle and Mauricio didn't begin their marriage as the couple fans eventually came to know. They started building their life together before Mauricio became the major real estate figure he is today. Kyle has described how they essentially built their life together from the beginning. Then everything grew. The business grew. The money grew. The fame grew. The travel increased. And suddenly, the lifestyle surrounding the marriage was completely different. Mauricio's real estate career became enormous. His company expanded. His professional responsibilities increased. And Kyle was simultaneously building her own career and maintaining a public life through the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. From the outside, success looked like the reward. But inside a relationship, success can create its own pressures. More work, more travel, more people, more attention, more opportunities, and less time together. Kyle has specifically said that she believes the pressures surrounding money and fame contributed to what happened between them. She also said that the public attention surrounding their lives could make relationships much harder. And then there's Los Angeles. Kyle offered a fascinating hypothetical during the season 15 reunion. She imagined a completely different life. A quieter life. A simpler life. She said that if they had moved away from Los Angeles, she could imagine Mauricio becoming a ski instructor in Vail while she stayed home with the children. And then she said something remarkable. She believes they might still be together if that had happened. Now, that doesn't mean Kyle believes Los Angeles alone destroyed her marriage. It was her personal theory about how their environment and lifestyle affected their relationship. But it gives us an entirely different way of looking at the separation. Maybe the question isn't simply, what happened between Kyle and Mauricio? Maybe it's, what happened to the life Kyle and Mauricio were building? Because sometimes relationships don't collapse because two people suddenly stop caring. Sometimes, their lives simply move in directions that make staying connected harder. One person is traveling. The other is managing the family. One career is expanding. The other person is dealing with a completely different set of pressures. And gradually, the distance becomes normal. That's something Kyle has talked about before. During the earlier discussions surrounding their marriage problems, she explained that issues could come up, but because they were busy with children, work, and life, some problems were pushed aside rather than fully resolved. She later said that some of those issues never went away. And that detail is important. Because it means the problems weren't necessarily brand new. Some issues were already there. They simply weren't dealt with completely. Then life continued. The family grew. The careers grew. The responsibilities grew. And eventually, the unresolved issues became impossible to ignore. Kyle has also said that she eventually lost trust and reached a breaking point. She has not publicly given every detail of the specific event that contributed to that loss of trust, so filling in the blanks would be speculation. But she has been clear about the emotional impact. She tried. She cared about her family. And she didn't initially imagine that the separation would become permanent. That's perhaps one of the saddest parts of this entire story. Because Kyle has admitted that she once believed the separation might only be temporary. She thought the relationship could come back. And then, it didn't. That's when a temporary crisis becomes something much more serious. Because you can survive a rough patch if you believe there's an end point. You can endure difficult conversations if you believe things will eventually return to normal. But when you realize that the old relationship isn't coming back, you have to start imagining a completely different future. And that's where Kyle and Mauricio appear to be now. Not necessarily enemies. Not necessarily strangers. But two people trying to understand what their relationship becomes after the marriage changes. And perhaps that's why the divorce hasn't happened yet. Because emotionally, the story is more complicated than simply saying, "It's over." Kyle has also explained that she and Mauricio have no prenup and built their financial life together over many years. That doesn't prove finances are the reason for the divorce delay, but it does illustrate how intertwined their lives became during the marriage. So when people ask why they haven't simply signed papers, there may not be one answer. It could be emotional. It could be family. It could be practical. It could be all of those things at once. But there's another detail that makes this even more fascinating. Despite everything, Kyle and Mauricio can still come together for their family. They've continued supporting their daughters during major milestones. And now, with Farah expecting her first child, that family connection is entering an entirely new chapter. So the marriage may be uncertain, but the family isn't disappearing. And perhaps that's the real challenge. How do you end a marriage without ending the family you've spent decades building? That question may be much harder than signing a document. And it could explain why Kyle and Mauricio have taken so long to make a final decision. But there's still one problem. Kyle herself has acknowledged that they can't remain in this undefined space forever. At some point, they have to decide what their future actually looks like. And when that decision finally comes, it could answer the biggest question fans have been asking since 2023. Was the separation always leading toward divorce? Or were Kyle and Mauricio simply trying to figure out whether there was another way forward? And that's where the story gets even more complicated. And this is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because Kyle and Mauricio aren't just trying to figure out what happens to their marriage. They are trying to figure out what happens to their family. And that distinction matters. After nearly 3 decades together, you can't simply erase the relationship and start over. There are memories. There are children. There are shared traditions. There are businesses. There are friendships. And there are decades of history connecting two people who once expected to grow old together. That's why their separation doesn't look like a traditional celebrity breakup. There hasn't been a complete war. There hasn't been a public campaign to destroy each other's reputations. Instead, they've continued finding ways to exist in the same family world. And Kyle has made it clear that maintaining that connection matters. Because regardless of what happens legally, Mauricio will always be the father of her daughters. And Kyle will always be the mother of his children. That doesn't disappear because a marriage changes. Now their family is entering an entirely new chapter. Their daughters are adults. They are building careers. They are creating relationships of their own. And now Farah is expecting a baby. Kyle has spoken about the excitement and uncertainty of becoming a grandmother, including figuring out exactly what she wants her grandchildren to call her. Think about how significant that is. Kyle and Mauricio may no longer be living as husband and wife. But they are still going to be connected through the next generation. They are going to share grandchildren. Family celebrations will continue. Birthdays will continue. Holiday gatherings may continue. Important milestones will continue. So even if the marriage officially ends, the relationship doesn't completely disappear. And perhaps that's one reason the divorce hasn't felt urgent to them. They've already created a way to function separately. They don't necessarily need a legal battle to prove that the marriage has changed. Their daily lives have already changed. But eventually, legal reality catches up with emotional reality. And that's where the gray area becomes difficult. Because Kyle has acknowledged that they won't remain in this situation forever. She has said there have been more conversations about what their future will look like. That means the question is no longer being ignored. They are talking about it. They are thinking about it. And they are deciding what makes sense. But there's another important part of Kyle's story. She has not portrayed Mauricio as someone she needs to destroy. In fact, she has repeatedly acknowledged the love and respect that remain between them. And that changes the emotional equation completely. Because if you hate your former partner, a clean break can feel like freedom. But if you still care about them, a divorce can feel like closing a door on an enormous part of your life. Even if you know the romantic relationship isn't working anymore. That's why people sometimes remain separated for years before finalizing a divorce. It's not always because they are secretly getting back together. Sometimes, they are simply trying to understand how to let go without turning love into hatred. And that seems particularly relevant here. Kyle isn't saying that she's waiting for Mauricio. She said the opposite. But she also isn't pretending that 27 years meant nothing. And Mauricio appears to be moving forward with his own life as well. So perhaps the goal isn't reconciliation. Perhaps the goal is something more complicated. A peaceful ending. A relationship that changes form without becoming toxic. Two people who no longer function as spouses, but can still function as family. That's a difficult balance. And it may take time. But then comes the biggest challenge. What happens when one of them becomes deeply committed to someone else? What happens when a new partner enters the picture? What happens when the emotional distance becomes permanent? At some point, the legal marriage may begin to feel increasingly out of step with their actual lives. And that could be the moment when everything changes. Because right now, Kyle and Mauricio have created a kind of middle ground. They've separated. They've moved forward individually. But they've maintained enough connection to keep the family functioning. The question is whether that arrangement can survive the next chapter. And that's why the conversations Kyle mentioned are so important. They are not necessarily conversations about getting back together. They may simply be conversations about accepting reality. What do we want? What does our family need? What should the next 5 or 10 years look like? And eventually, do we officially end the marriage? That's the decision waiting at the end of this road. But there is one final piece to this story. Kyle has been changing too. The woman who entered the marriage decades ago isn't the same woman standing here today. She's experienced fame, motherhood, success, loss, independence, and now, a completely different version of adulthood. So perhaps the divorce question isn't only about Mauricio. Maybe it's also about Kyle deciding who she wants to be in the next chapter of her own life. And that could be the real turning point. Because once someone discovers that they can build a life independently, the question changes from, can this marriage be saved? To, what kind of future do I actually want? And that's the question Kyle and Mauricio may finally be facing. The answer could be divorce. It could be continued separation. Or something nobody expects. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The gray area cannot last forever. And when they finally choose a direction, the entire story of Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky may look very different in hindsight. And now, after everything we've uncovered, the separation, the years apart, the different lives, the family milestones, the unanswered questions, there is one conclusion that seems much more realistic than the dramatic theories circulating online. Kyle and Mauricio may simply not want their 27-year history to end in a war. That doesn't mean they are secretly back together. It doesn't mean Kyle is waiting for Mauricio. And it doesn't mean a divorce isn't coming. It means something much more complicated. They still have a relationship. Just not the same relationship they once had. Kyle has been clear that there is still love and respect between them. And after nearly 3 decades together, that's understandable. You don't erase a lifetime of memories because 2 people stop working as a married couple. You don't erase the children you raised together. You don't erase the businesses you built. You don't erase the family traditions. And you certainly don't erase the history. That's why the question shouldn't simply be, why haven't they signed the papers? The better question is, what exactly are they trying to protect? And the answer may be their family. Because even if Kyle and Mauricio eventually divorce, they will still be connected. Their daughters will always connect them. Their grandchildren will connect them. Family celebrations will connect them. Their shared history will connect them. So perhaps they've been trying to figure out how to end the marriage without ending the relationship that still matters. And that's a very different kind of separation. It's not necessarily about refusing to move on. It's about moving forward carefully. Kyle has already said she's not waiting around for Mauricio to return. Mauricio has also continued living his own life. So the evidence doesn't point to a secret reconciliation as the obvious explanation. Instead, it points toward 2 people trying to redefine what they mean to each other. And perhaps that's why the process has taken so long. Because a legal divorce is permanent. But their family connection isn't. Once the papers are signed, the legal relationship changes forever. And maybe they wanted to be certain before making that decision. After 27 years. That's not unreasonable. There is also the reality of everything they built together. Their finances. Their properties. Their businesses. Their family responsibilities. Their public lives. Even if the emotional decision has already been made. The practical separation can be complicated. And that's something fans rarely see. Reality television gives viewers the dramatic moments. It gives them arguments, conversations, reactions. But it doesn't show every financial meeting, every private discussion, every decision about property, every conversation about the children. Those things happen away from the cameras. And they are often what make divorce take time. But perhaps the biggest reason is emotional. Kyle has changed. Mauricio has changed. And their marriage has changed. The people who married decades ago aren't exactly the same people they are today. Their priorities evolved. Their careers evolved. Their family evolved. Their individual identities evolved. And eventually, the relationship had to evolve too. Maybe they couldn't make the old version of their marriage work. But that doesn't mean every part of their relationship had to disappear. That's the distinction that seems to define their situation. Marriage may be uncertain. But family isn't. Romance may have changed. But respect can remain. Living together may no longer work. But being there for their children still can. And that may be the real reason this divorce has moved so slowly. Not because there's some secret scandal waiting to be exposed. But because the ending of a marriage doesn't necessarily mean the ending of love, history, or family. Still, Kyle has acknowledged that the gray area won't last forever. And that may be the most important statement of all. Because eventually, a decision has to happen. Either they officially end the marriage, or they find some other direction that makes sense for both of them. And when that happens, the public will finally understand what this long separation was really about. Was it simply the slow process of accepting that the marriage was over? Was it an attempt to protect their family? Was it a way to give both people time to discover who they were outside the relationship? Or did they simply need years to accept that loving someone doesn't always mean staying married to them? Maybe it's all of those things. And perhaps that's why this story continues to fascinate people. Because there isn't a simple villain. There isn't a single shocking moment that explains everything. There are just two people who spent almost 3 decades together and are now trying to figure out how to move forward. So when the divorce finally happens, if it happens, it may not be the explosive ending everyone expects. It may simply be the final legal step in a process that emotionally began years earlier. And maybe that's the real truth. The divorce hasn't happened because Kyle and Mauricio haven't been ready to turn a complicated relationship into a permanent legal ending. They've been separated. They've been living their own lives. But they've also been protecting something that still exists between them. Family. And eventually, they'll have to decide what that family relationship looks like after the marriage officially ends. Until then, the gray area continues. Kyle continues discovering her future. Mauricio continues building his. Their daughters continue creating lives of their own. And the family keeps growing. So perhaps the final chapter isn't really about whether Kyle and Mauricio will divorce. It's about whether two people can close the chapter of their marriage without closing the chapter of everything they built together. And that may be the real story nobody saw coming. If you enjoyed this breakdown, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more Real Housewives drama, celebrity relationship stories, and the latest developments. Because with Kyle Richards and Mauricio Umansky, the marriage may still be unresolved. But one thing is certain. Their story isn't over yet.